Great. So my name is Neil Ullman. I'm an energy resource professional in the Energy Office of the Montana Department of Environmental Quality. Thank you all for joining us today for our National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program webinar. NEVI is what we'll be calling it from now on. First of all, I want to go through a few housekeeping items for logistics of a Zoom meeting. Again, we are recording this meeting. We'll have it available hopefully later on this week for review. Everyone has automatically been muted, towards the end of the webinar, the second half of the webinar, we'll be taking questions and public comments on this formula program funding. And when we get to that point, please use the raise your hand feature in the Zoom app to indicate you'd like to speak. You can also use the chat feature, which may also actually be more useful so that we can record public comments after this webinar is over. If you're on the phone, which I see a couple of you are, you can use *6 to unmute yourself and also *9 to raise your hand so that we know that you have something that you would like to say. There's also a link on Zoom if you're having any trouble, but hopefully we'll be able to get to all the questions that you all want to provide, as well as the public comments. Before we get started in the details of the NEVI formula program funding, I just want to make sure that we go through some basics of electric vehicle terminology, make sure that we're all on the same page of what type of things we're talking about. For some people, there's a lot of confusion on the differences between hybrid vehicles, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, and battery electric vehicles, or just simply the term electric vehicle. For the purposes of this webinar, we're talking about battery electric vehicles. So hybrid vehicles are gasoline-powered vehicles that have a small battery to help improve fuel economy. These are vehicles, what you would think of like a Toyota Prius. Plug-in hybrid electric vehicles actually do have electric motors, but have smaller battery capacities and have a gasoline backup. So vehicles like the Chevy Volt, the Toyota Prius Prime, or the Ford C-Max Energy have electric-powered engines, have electric batteries that have a range of only between 20 to 50 miles, but do also use gasoline to power those electric motors. For the purposes of this funding opportunity and the plan that we're in the process of developing in coordination with Montana Department of Transportation, we're talking about battery electric, all electric vehicles that only run electricity, have a range of anywhere between 150 to 300 miles. And examples would be pretty much any Tesla vehicle, a Chevy Bolt, or the new Ford F-150 Lightning that some of you may have read about recently. For charging, there's also a lot of different options. There's charging that you can use just your regular 110 outlet at home in your garage. There's also level 2 charging that I can explain in just a moment. There's also level 3 DC fast charging. And at that level, there's a number of different plugs. For the purposes of this plan, we're talking about the CCS combo plug. The CCS combo plug works in generally any electric vehicle, especially ones that up until recently have been manufactured by companies from Europe or North America. The CHAdeMO plug is, in our opinion, kind of going away. Vehicles that use that include the Nissan Leaf. Tesla has its own proprietary plug, but they also have an adapter to be able to use the CCS combo. The J1772 plug works for level 2, generally at-home charging, as well as level 1 charging. But for the purposes of this program, I want to make clear that we're talking about the CCS combo plug. So why are we talking about this? This is funding. The NEVI program, formula program, is a program that was created by the recently passed by Congress and signed into law by the President, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Funding Act, or also I may be referring to it as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. It included $5 billion or $7.5 billion for electric vehicle charging stations. There was one pot of $5 billion for this NEVI program. And it's, again, a formula program, and Montana is slated to receive approximately $43 million over 5 years in this formula program funding. The purpose is to help support a convenient, affordable, reliable, and equitable national EV charging network. And funds will be initially located to locations along Federal Highway Administration designated EV corridors, electric vehicle corridors. We'll get to that in a moment. And the focus also is on rural areas and underserved communities for electric vehicle infrastructure. The other 2.5 billion is going to be going through what's being referred to as a community grant program grants. We have not received really any guidance from the Federal Highway Administration on the community grants. So again, for the purposes of this webinar, we'll be talking about the NEVI formula program. The timeline so far for the NEVI program has been that the law was signed by President Biden on November 15th last year. On February 10th, the FHWA, the Federal Highway Administration, released guidance on the program and how it's going to be structured, and also some of the minimum guidelines. There's more guidelines that'll be released on by May 13th by FHWA. For the February 10th guidelines, if you've already visited DEQ's Alternative Fuels website, you can read that guidance, or you can go to the link below. The U.S. Department of Transportation and the U.S. Department of Energy created a joint office on energy and transportation, and you can find that website on driveelectric.gov. And then if you go to the technical assistance page, you can learn more about the guidance. The first step in this development is, so I forgot that I needed to first introduce our special guest, and I apologize for that. Chris Dorrington is on, he's our department director for DEQ, and I'd like to have him give a few additional words before I go even further. Apologies, Chris.
No worries at all. Thanks, Neil. Good afternoon, and thank you for the robust attendance today. I know we have quite a number of participants. Looks like 111, so that's awesome. Thanks for joining us today. I've been looking forward to this call, partly just to kick this off and develop our electric vehicle infrastructure plan with your input. I'm excited about working with MDT and hearing all of your feedback today. As Neil started off, we have quite an expertise here at DEQ, and that comes from some of our history with working on the electric vehicle charging infrastructure in the 2017 settlement of Volkswagen. Efficient distribution of these federal funds that Neil began with will leverage ongoing private investment to grow Montana's electric vehicle charging infrastructure without the use of state funds. These funds are part of the larger bipartisan infrastructure bill that Neil began introducing there, and are intended to develop publicly available electric vehicle fast charging stations along interstate and U.S. highway corridors. A few weeks ago, we announced our partnership with MDT to plan how the state of Montana will use these funds. And we're excited that this new partnership will leverage MDT's expertise in transportation funding and planning with DEQ's experience in planning and deployment of electric vehicle infrastructure. I'll close my remarks by saying, like Governor Gianforte, I look forward to the opportunities that clean vehicles represent for our state and region. We're certainly interested in corridor connectivity. And here's the thing, encouraging the use of cleaner vehicles, including electric vehicles, not only create jobs and promote the tourism travel industries in Montana, but also improve the environment, the health of Montanans. And with that, I just thank you all for joining us today. I look forward to today's webinar, and I turn it over to Dwayne Cayley, Mr. Cayley with MDT for his comments and introduction as well. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Chris. And for everybody's benefit, this is Dwayne Cayley with MDT. I'm the Chief Operating Officer. I'm sitting in for Mac Long, the director, who unfortunately was unavailable today. I really want to echo a lot of what Chris's comments were. I'm excited to work with DEQ and on this project to help deliver a needed resource and opportunity for the state of Montana. Just to kind of set expectations, MDT's main role is simply going to be to assist DEQ and help assure federal aid compliance. Anybody that's worked with 23 CFR funds understands that there's a lot of red tape that goes with it, and that's one of our areas of expertise, and that's going to be our main role in this function. Another area that I'd kind of like to manage expectations on is there's a lot of numbers out there floating around about what's in the new bill, bipartisan infrastructure law and or IIJA. One of the areas that gets confusing is how much money is really in there, and to set kind of manage expectations right now, what we're being told is that IIJA actually only has about 6.3 million for EV over the 5 years. Slight growth, but not much growth over the 5 years. So hopefully we'll get more clarity from the feds on that. But even with that, I think there is quite a bit of opportunity to make a good impact and deploy quite a bit of equipment out there to assist the traveling public. I think this is a great benefit for Montana, and I look forward to this project, and thank you all. With that, I'll turn it back to Neil.
Thank you, Dwayne and Chris, and apologies again. You can tell how excited I am and we are at DEQ and MDT to get into the details of this funding opportunity. So let me pull my presentation back up again and pick up where we left off on the timeline. And again, Dwayne was using those same terms with the bipartisan infrastructure law and the IIJA, the infrastructure law. So one of the first steps before we even get to the funding, before we get to giving out grant awards or things of that nature for this opportunity, is that the Federal Highway Administration is requiring every state to create and develop and submit a EV deployment plan. And the plan will look at each state, and here in Montana, we'll look at our existing infrastructure, our existing interest and public comment that we're going to be starting to solicit today. And that'll then later inform what the funding opportunity will look like. And those EV deployment plans have to be submitted to FHWA and to the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation by or on August 1st of this year. So we're going to be doing a lot of outreach. We're going to be looking for your feedback and comments as part of our public survey that I'll talk about in a little while. That'll help inform what that deployment plan looks like. Once those plans are submitted and then approved by FHWA before or on September 30th, then we will be able to start using the infrastructure funding. But the main focus of this webinar is to let you all know the background of the program and also to start getting your public feedback. So in the EV deployment plan, which again needs to be submitted by August 1st, the plans need to be approved for the NEVI funds can be spent. DEQ's Energy Office, myself, working with MDT and staff within both agencies will work to develop the plan. Key outreach efforts will include not only this webinar with the overview of the NEVI program, but also public comments on Montana's plan. That'll include the public survey that I'll talk about in a moment, and also direct stakeholder outreach. So on the public survey, we have on our DEQ's website, on our Clean Transportation page, a Survey Monkey public survey that anybody, especially Montanans, should feel free to share and fill out amongst organizations, collaborations that you all already have. And please provide us with any and all information that you think should be considered as part of our deployment plan. Again, Montana will receive an estimated $43 million over the course of 5 years. Our first allocation is approximately $6.3 million. And so those are the funding amounts that we'll have to work with over the course of the 5-year program that was created by Congress for NEVI. The plan will incorporate public and stakeholder outreach and input on how the state should prioritize corridors, locations, station requirements, safety and security issues, workforce development, and also planning for the future. Once the plan is approved by the Federal Highway Administration, funding can then be obligated, likely through a competitive RFA process. But some of that is still be determined because the deployment plan will inform the details of a potential request for applications. So when I keep talking about corridors, MDT and DEQ over the last couple of years have submitted applications to designate electric vehicle pending corridors. And what we've done so far is we've designated the entire length of I-15, I-90, I-94, Highway 2, and Highway 93 as electric vehicle pending corridors. NEVI funds can only be spent along these designated corridors. And so in anticipation of this funding possibly being made available by Congress, which it finally was last year, we went ahead and designated these corridors. So for communities along these corridors, we would expect to hopefully install fast charging station locations. Now, what do these individual locations mean? Right now, what we know from the February 10th guidance from the Federal Highway Administration, we know that for each location, so for example, if there was one in Shelby, or if there was one in Big Timber or any other community across the state, each location would need to have a fast charging station that can provide up to 150 or a minimum, of 150 kilowatts of power to a single vehicle. Each station would have a CCS plug, which we talked about at the beginning of the webinar. And each location would have to have 4 of these fast charging chargers that can simultaneously charge 4 vehicles. So ideally through the NEVI program guidance that we've received so far, each of those locations in Shelby, for example, would have 4 150 kilowatt capacity chargers, each with a CCS combo plug that could charge 4 vehicles at the same time. There are fast charging locations around the country where if you have one vehicle plugged in and another vehicle were to pull up and were to start charging, the capacity going into that first vehicle would lessen. And we wanted to make sure, or the Federal Highway Administration wants to make sure that through this funding that when you plug in, you continue to get the maximum amount of charges you can do. Again, each of these locations that have the 450 kilowatt capacity chargers should be available, publicly available 24/7, should be located no more than 50 miles apart from each other, and should be within 1 mile of one travel mile of each of those travel corridors that I showed you on the map just a moment ago, and should also be located within 1/4 mile of amenities including, but not limited to, rest stops or bathrooms, restaurants and shopping and things of that nature. The operational minimum requirements of these locations need to achieve at least 97% reliability so that an electric vehicle driver can have with near certain confidence that when they pull into one of these locations with these 4 fast chargers that they will be working and operational. These locations also need to be operated and maintained in the same location for no less than 5 years. And again, we'll know more about the minimum requirements of these fast charging locations when the Federal Highway Administration puts out additional technical guidance on or by May 13th. So in developing the EV deployment plan, any interested Montana individual or entity should participate in the process to develop this deployment plan. You can visit DEQ's website, which you see below, to fill out our public survey and also to sign up for email updates. The plan will include, when we submit it to the Federal Highway Administration, will include our efforts to get public engagement, analysis of existing and future conditions for electric vehicles and fast charging locations in Montana, what the goals and vision of our 5-year plan will look like, and also how we intend to implement the NEVI program, including cybersecurity plans to make sure that electric vehicle drivers using these fast charging stations will know that their information will be kept secure. Key areas for input on the deployment plan, which again, you can find more information on driveelectric.gov on what those the guidance includes, as well as a draft template plan would look like. But some of the areas we're going to be looking for your feedback and input on is, should the state prioritize certain corridors or locations? So you saw those 5 corridors, $6.3 million as a first installment is not enough. to fully build out at 50-mile increments, all 5 of those corridors. But there are probably areas that we should focus that initial investment on. Where should those places be? We need your help to identify what corridors and what parts of those corridors we should identify in our deployment plan. Also, should charging stations have different or higher requirements than the minimum federal guidelines? I mentioned that each of those fast charging stations at each location needs to provide at least a minimum of 150 kilowatts. Well, that's the minimum. Should we go higher? Higher is more expensive, but maybe there's value as technologies continue to evolve and improve to doing higher than that. Or maybe for the time being, we should just do the 150 kilowatts, which would be a significant improvement to what we have here in Montana already. So we need your input. Should there be faster and more chargers? You can also, as an eligible cost for these, attach renewable energy, storage, or also future-proof locations. So for right now, maybe 4 stations at a single location is enough. Maybe in the future it won't be. We're hearing stories already of a fast charging station in Bozeman where they're having issues accommodating as many people who want to use those fast charging stations. Luckily, they future-proofed. Should we also do that through these NEVI formula programs for these new charging locations? Also, what challenges do electric vehicle drivers face in Montana, and how can this funding address those issues? Whether it's geographic, weather, distance, population, whatever the case may be, we need to hear from you in order to understand better from people living all across Montana what those challenges may be. Also, what safety issues should be addressed. So the public survey answers a lot of these questions. There's also a question towards the end that allows you to put in whatever other issues we may not have touched on that you've thought of that we should be considering in this deployment plan. These are the main contacts. Myself, Neil Ullman, as well as my coworker at the Energy Office, Kyla Mackey, will be heading DEQ's efforts to develop this deployment plan. Our colleague Carol Strzic over at MDT will be our counterpart, helping us with this outreach throughout this process from now until August 1st, excuse me. Again, DEQ's website below is deq.mt.gov/energy/program/fuels. And there you can find, you'll eventually be able to find a recording of this webinar. You'll be able to find a link to our public survey, as well as a link to the February 10th guidance that we've received so far from the Federal Highway Administration. So at this point, what we would like to do is, this is going to be our first opportunity to receive public comment. I just threw a lot of information at you. So some people may want to take time to think more about what kind of comments they would like to submit to the state, and then provide those through the public survey, or you can also provide them now. Staff will not be responding to comments, but may provide clarifications to comments or questions. So if you want to ask a question before you make your public comment, then we can answer that question just to make sure that you're comfortable addressing the issue that you want to address. But if you make a specific comment on a suggestion for our deployment plan, we'll simply be keeping notes of that and considering it as we put together the state's deployment plan. And again, we'll be considering these throughout, and any public comments that we receive from now through June 30th will be considered as we develop our public EV deployment plan that we'll end up submitting to the Federal Highway Administration before August 1st. So at this point, I'm going to leave this up just so that people can remember how to mute and unmute yourself and to use the raise hand feature. So what questions or comments do we have so far?
Hi, folks. This is Ben Brower with Montana DEQ. I'm going to be helping to facilitate the Q&A and comment period. Neil, we have a couple questions that have come in so far. One from Marianne Dunwell. Representative Dunwell asks, is there any chance you could also designate Highway 12 through Helena to Three Forks, where it hooks up to Interstate 90, as a charging station corridor too? Thank you. Lots of people commute and travel that way between Missoula, Helena to I-90 to Bozeman. Neil, could you speak to this question of designating additional alternative fuel corridors?
Absolutely. Thank you, Representative Dunwell. So currently, the Federal Highway Administration does have a new round open to designate additional highway corridors. And that is open until May 13th. So we could potentially designate additional highways to be eligible for this funding. Right now, we do not have plans to do that. There will be opportunities to do that over the next 5 years as more funding comes to the states. But if the public and Representative Dunwell makes her case for why that particular highway should be designated, if the public thinks that we should be doing that, then we ask that in the public survey. So make sure to provide us your thoughts on on whether or not we should do more designations. We certainly do know that there are a lot of key travel corridors. And so this will be something that we're definitely seeking more input on from Montanans. So thank you, Representative Dunwell.
Neil, next question is in the chat from Chuck McGraw. Chuck asks, can you give us a sense of what the 6.3 million would accomplish in the way of filling up the 5 corridors?
So the short answer, Chuck, is it depends. It depends on whether or not the public and the state's deployment plan wants to go beyond the minimum requirements of the Federal Highway Administration and do, for example, higher capacity, or do storage at locations, or tie-ins to renewable energy sources like solar panels. We've done some estimates, but it also depends on specific sites. If you're doing a location that's in a super small community that maybe right now doesn't quite have the grid capacity to host a charging station location with these minimum requirements, there may be additional upgrades required. Maybe some of our more bigger communities across the state, maybe they're already ready to go. We don't know. But potentially, $6.3 million could maybe do anywhere between 5 and 9 locations. But again, there are a lot of caveats that go along with that.
Okay, thank you, Neil. Next question is from Andrew Valanis. Andrew asks, are there any plans to co-locate solar storage with any of the charging infrastructure? Does this particular funding opportunity allow funding for co-location of solar? I wouldn't want to water down the EVSE funding, but co-location provides numerous benefits.
Well, that's what part of this public outreach is, Andrew, and we sure appreciate your interest in it. There are no plans because we are in the process of developing the plan that will inform that request for information later on. So again, if Montanans think that tying directly into renewable sources of energy or energy storage systems to help take some of the demand off the electrical grid is something that Montana should do, then we will definitely consider those. So please submit your comments through our public survey on how and why we should consider doing that as a state.
Neil, a related question from Caroline Lauer in the Q&A. What is the cost premium, roughly speaking, for including renewable energy at charging stations?
That's actually a very good question. I do not know the answer to that, but that'll be a lot of the stakeholder outreach that we do during the course of the spring and summer, is to find out what that means, what the benefits, what the drawbacks could be, and also what the cost could be.
Neil, a question from Joseph Hauk in the chat. Will these charging stations be installed only by private contractors? Will they be installed only on private land?
Well, that's again a part of the public outreach that we're waiting to hear back from Montanans on. I can tell you that with the experience that DEQ has had so far with the Volkswagen settlement funds that Chris Dorrington, our director, alluded to at the beginning of his presentation, is we put out a request for applications in November of 2020, and we've executed grant agreements with those awarded entities. And the way that we did it was, the way that they ultimately got funded is they will be owned by private entities, and they will be on private land. That wasn't a requirement of the program. That's just the way that the applications ended up coming in. And so we want to know, again, through this public outreach process, what Montanans think. Should they only be on private land, or should they only be eligible to receive funding from private entities? That's the way it's worked in our brief experience so far, but we need to know from Montana what makes sense.
Neil, a question from Senator Diane Sands. Senator Sands asked, is there any discussion about Highway 200? Will private entities cover that area? She notes that it's a huge rural area.
Absolutely. Again, to a similar question to what Representative Dunwell asked, we need to hear from Montanans on whether or not we should add additional corridors. We could do it right now before May 13th, or we could also see how the program shakes out for the next year and how far these dollars end up going. And we could designate these corridors at a later date. We'll be having to do this public outreach every year, probably, to make sure that we're achieving the goals and the vision of what our deployment plan ends up including when we submit it on August 1st, and whether or not we need to make changes to it in terms of identifying corridors. Obviously, as we build out locations and fund locations, we can hopefully check those off the to-do list and add others. Do we need to add other corridors? So getting feedback from Montana will be important to determine whether or not we do decide to, whether or not and when we decide to do additional corridor designations.
Neil, we have a comment from Ray Brown. Ray notes, although Highway 200 is parallel to the interstate, it is a greater gateway to Glacier that funnels a ton of Coeur d'Alene, Spokane, and Sandpoint traffic. Would love to see a charging station in Thompson Falls. Thank you for your comment, Ray. Next question is from Brant Seats. Question is it necessary for all 4 chargers to be able to simultaneously charge at 150 kilowatts, or is it acceptable to derate the chargers to a lower power level during periods of high demand? The comment notes, Tesla does this at some of their stations. This could significantly decrease electrical demand charges and thus operational charges.
The points are well taken, but from the guidance that we did receive from the Federal Highway Administration on February 10th, it is required that if there are 4 vehicles using each of those 4 charging stations at a single location, that they all have to be able to receive at least 150 kilowatt charge to their vehicle. So that means that each charging location funded with these NEVI funds have to have a minimum capacity of 600 kilowatts. That's currently the way that it's written. I don't know if there will be any update to that particular part of the guidance by in the May 13th, but right now it's pretty clear in there that that's the minimum requirements. And I think that it says that if you really want to dive into the details on this particular part of it, if you go to the February 10th guidelines issued by FHWA in the joint office, it's on page 12 where it says that.
Moving back to the chat, there's a comment from Susan Evans. Susan notes, since Montana depends upon tourism, I would like to see provisions for people visiting our national parks and forests. Thank you for the comment, Susan. Moving to our next question from Steve Claremont. With this funding, how many charging stations are you anticipating in each funded location?
Well, so the requirement, if I understand the question correctly, under the current guidance for each location, so Kalispell, for example, would have to have the location funded in Kalispell with these funds would have to have at least 4 chargers that could simultaneously charge at 150 kilowatt capacity for electric vehicles. If the question is how much with all of the funding, how many locations across the state will we be able to do? Similar to my response earlier to Chuck, the question is, I guess the answer is I don't know, and it depends. It depends on whether or not we decide to do 1 or more of the 4 chargers at a higher capacity, whether or not there's storage or renewable tie-ins involved, whether or not there's additional upgrades to that particular location for that community that would need to happen. We just don't know right now. And in terms of all those I don't knows and it depends, those questions are going to be answered by you, Montana, on whether or not we should require some of these when we finally do put out the funding opportunities.
Thanks, Neil. Going back to the chat for a question from Amy Stillenberg. Amy asks, can you describe how future-proofing works?
One of the advantages of any kind of construction project is having the stuff underground done and paved over so that you don't have to dig it back up again. And so when you have, in this case, charging stations, and you know for right now that you want to have a certain number of chargers in your parking lot, you wire them and you get them all ready to go. But if you think that you might want to do more in the future, then you can have additional wiring put in underneath your parking lot or wherever it is these locations are going to be, so that you can be ready to install the charger above ground at a later date. But not knowing whether or not you're going to need those additional charging capacities, you can simply have them wired underground so that you don't need to dig up that concrete and redo the wiring at a later date. So that's what future proofing looks like. And one of the eligible costs for NEVI funds is to do future proofing, should we require that in Montana. As part of this funding opportunity, potential funding opportunity as part of our deployment plan that'll inform that RFA when it comes out will be the question, but I hope that answered your question.
Neil, a question back to the Q&A from an anonymous attendee. Will the state request a waiver once the corridors are built out for other chargers and for other sites besides direct current fast charging near highway corridors?
Again, I think the question is, we don't know. The question will be is how much of these corridors we can get built out with these funding amounts that we'll receive from the NEVI program over the next 5 years. What, if any, private investments will happen over the next 5 years. There's other private entities, both in and out of Montana, that have already been doing charging station locations, and we don't know what ultimately we'll end up having. Maybe Kyla has something to add.
Yeah, just to. Oh, wait. Yeah, just to add on to what Neil was saying, on the seeking a waiver, once the corridors are built out, NEVI guidance does say that once the state's corridors are built out and they've been determined to be built out by FHWA, then the state can put funds towards other locations. So it's eligible to go beyond the corridors once the current designated corridors are fully built out. And so some states are considering just keeping the corridors designated as is so they can put funds elsewhere and have that flexibility.
Neil, Kyla, jumping ahead one question to another question from Chuck on a related point. Why not? Is there a reason not to designate additional corridors right now? Could you just, is there anything more that you want to say on that question?
Well, one reason could be to the point that Kyla just brought up, is that if we are successful in building out these corridors that we've already designated, future rounds of this formula funding could then go to wherever we want. So as we, fill out I-90, Highway 2, and the other 3 corridors that we mentioned, we could just start putting it wherever we wanted to. So the advantage could be that by not designating additional corridors, it'll give us more flexibility once we fill out the current 5. But until we do that, we don't know whether or not we're going to be able to accomplish that, and what kind of other developments will happen over the coming years. The community grants program that I briefly mentioned at the beginning of the presentation could also go to non-corridor locations. We still, again, don't know a whole lot of details behind that program, but what we do know is it could go off the corridors. So there could be an opportunity for an entity to apply directly to the Federal Highway Administration for those community grants and do a project along Highway 200 or Highway 12 or whatever the case may be that are the non-designated corridors right now.
Neil, a somewhat related question from the Q&A, also from an anonymous attendee. How will the state ensure rural communities aren't excluded from electric vehicle charging infrastructure build out? All of this funding is for charging infrastructure near highway corridors.
It's a great question, and one that we're very cognizant of is that, well, first of all, one of the main reasons is that for our larger communities, they're not 50 miles apart, which is what this funding requires. These locations be no more than 50 miles apart. So if we're trying to build out a fast charging corridor along I-90, for example, Missoula, Butte, Bozeman, Billings are all more than 50 miles apart. And so we're absolutely going to have to build in locations to fill in those gaps. And a lot of those are smaller communities. The same goes for the other 4 corridors. But we do certainly need to make sure that people aren't just trying to get from point A to point B across Montana and skipping our rural communities that have their own flavor and charm that we all want to visit, that I love visiting personally. And so making sure that we can get electric vehicle drivers, not only Montanans, but also tourism interests to visit local communities, rural communities will be important. And so initially, yes, along these 5 designated corridors, we may be only focusing on those, but depending on the feedback that we get from Montanans, we've heard a lot of it so far just this afternoon, excuse me, there may be interest in building out or, doing more corridor designations. And then also, again, there may be private investments or additional federal funding available to focus more on either non-designated corridors or just other rural communities spread across Montana.
A question back in the chat from Ian Lund. Ian asks, does funding cover make-ready infrastructure without actually including chargers? In other words, building 4 chargers, but enough infrastructure to support 8, e.g. a future-proof. I think we've covered this, but do you want to comment to this question specifically on future-proofing?
Yeah, I can go ahead and take this one, Ben. So Neil answered the future-proofing question, and the funding can go towards future-proofing, which is a little different. I mean, it can be similar than make-ready, but make-ready is a specific term for when typically utilities would come in and pay for everything up into the charging station itself. And so several utilities are doing that in their own funding programs in other states. We're waiting for the May 13th guidance to know for sure what specific make-ready costs are eligible, or if a make-ready program that a utility would fund would be an eligible cost underneath this. But that is something we do want to hear from those who would be interested in hosting these stations or utilities about whether those make-ready costs should be eligible and what the extent of those costs may be. So that's a good point and a good question about participation, typically again from utilities in funding everything up into the charging unit itself.
So what a Montana program would look like would also be something that we would definitely want to hear about and consider as we put together our deployment plan. Thank you, Ian.
Neil, Kyla, going to a raised hand in our list of attendees. Jaslyn Guerrero, I'm going to allow you to talk. If you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question or provide your comment. You're up.
Hello, thank you. I actually don't have a question or comment. I'm just observing, but I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Back to the chat. There's one clarification offered to Chuck's earlier question about how much $6.3 million can cover. See the chat there for a link to testimony provided by Dan Lloyd, the Bureau Chief for the Montana Energy Office, to the Transportation Interim Committee recently. Moving down to a question from, I'm not seeing the name here. The question is DEQ, DOT coordinating with the Public Service Commission or with individual electric cooperatives or utilities to understand potential grid issues? Neil, Kyla?
Yeah, I can take this one. So yes, the answer is yes, we will be coordinating, particularly with the co-ops and utilities and doing specific outreach to them about potential grid issues associated with these locations, being that there has to be at least 600 kilowatts of capacity. Some locations could be more constrained than others. And so we do want to identify what those locations are, what the costs of potentially potential upgrades would be. But the grid issues are one. This is a new load that's coming on and can be somewhat unpredictable. So that is a good point and a good question, and something we'll be doing specific outreach in addition to our general public outreach. We'll be reaching out to utilities as well as the PSC and staff.
Neil, a question from Jameson Lee. Has there been more resolution on a standardized payment method, i.e. credit card terminals? There are many networks out there, and this could be cumbersome for drivers to jump between.
That's a good point, Jameson. And if you look at the February 10th guidance, there's a lot of places in this guidance where the Federal Highway Administration says additional information will be provided in support of this effort. So I think that that's still a question that we need to get answered. Making sure that it's as flexible and as accommodating as possible is a key thing in the funding that we put out that I mentioned earlier from our Volkswagen settlement funds. We said that we needed there needed to be at least two, I think, ways to pay. And that could be a credit card swiper or using, like if you put your phone close to it, it sometimes will let you use a credit card saved to your phone, or obviously apps is another way of doing it. Sometimes if you really want to go through some trouble, there's also an 800 number that you can call. But we're hoping to get some more details, I think, Jameson, on that point on the May 13th guidance.
Back to a question in the chat from Annabelle Drayton. Oregon DOT just presented on NEVI and their plans. They mentioned there's a 20% match requirement. How will DEQ MDT meet this requirement?
So as part of the federal funding written into the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Federal Highway Administration can provide up to 80% of the cost of one of these charging locations or a project if it includes multiple locations. There is a 20% non-federal requirement. So if you were to get money, for example, from that community grants program that I was referencing earlier, that's also a part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, you could not use that as the 20% non-federal match because it is itself federal funding. So wherever that non-federal 20% would come from, in our experience, again, with our Volkswagen settlement dollars that we've been working on the last few years, the state using the Volkswagen settlement dollars put up a maximum of 80%, and then the 20% was provided by the private entities that ended up getting the awards. And in many cases, that ended up being more than 20%, so we ended up providing less than 80%. But yes, there is a minimum 80-20 cost share, 80% from the NEVI program and 20% non-federal.
Back to the Q&A, a question from an anonymous attendee. Are there any requirements on who can or should own and operate the chargers once they are installed? Who is responsible for the operational costs?
The guidance from the 20th does say that the Federal Highway Administration anticipates that states will have private entities owning these charging stations and the locations. They do say that the state could own it, but again, going off of a model from our previous Volkswagen funding opportunity I keep alluding to, where we did the private entity is owning and operating these charging stations that we funded through Volkswagen. That's kind of what we're looking at this point. But again, this public comment period that will be accepting comments through our public survey and on this webinar through June 30th is where we're looking for guidance from Montanans. But in our experience so far, it's been the private entities that owns and operates those charging stations.
Neil, a question from Chuck in the chat. In applying the 50-mile apart limitation, can the state take into account the location of existing charging stations? So for example, could you measure from an existing charging station in Big Timber?
So right now, one of the things on driveelectric.gov, the Joint Office of Transportation and Energy's website, where this guidance is all coming out, they, for each state, identify what the NEVI compliant charging station locations are in each state. In Montana, we have two. One is at the Flying J in Rocker, just outside of Butte, and the other is at the Walmart off of Reserve in Missoula. Those fast charging station locations each have at least 4 chargers that can charge at a capacity of at least 150 kilowatts. Those are all owned and operated by an entity called Electrify America. There's also an Electrify America location at the Dell Market on I-15, but it does not have 4 charging stations. It has 3, so it is not what's considered NEVI compliant. So from those existing locations in Rocker and Missoula, yes, you could build out from 50 miles from each of those existing locations from what the guidance says. But there's also nothing prohibiting us from building additional fast charging locations in Missoula or Butte or Rocker, I guess.
Neil, a question from Brent Ricks. In order to ensure fairness and equitability in the marketplace, Montana Weights and Measures will need to inspect, test, and certify these devices. Would funding be available for these purposes?
That's a good question, Brent. That's the question that I followed up with you on. The short answer is I don't know, but that is something that we should definitely look into. Because Weights and Measures was an area that the Federal Highway Administration told the states to look into, which is why I contacted the Department of Labor and Industry. But it sounds like that's going to be a significant cost, and we need to look into that. So thank you.
Question in the Q&A from Dan Brandborg. Within this program, are there any retail electric cost per kilowatt hour control measures for charge station entities?
So not to directly avoid the question, but to avoid the question, the issue right now in Montana is that when you pay for electricity coming from a charging station, so those Electrify America stations I mentioned just a second ago in Missoula and Rocker and Dell, those are ones at a Walmart, ones at a Flying J, ones at a small gas station, the Dell Market. Those entities where those locations are and Electrify America cannot charge by the kilowatt hour under Montana law. So instead, you're charged by the amount of time that you're plugged in and using electricity. Now, one of the things about that is that depending on the type of electric vehicle that you have, they can accept different rates of charge, different capacities of charge. So it may take longer to charge up one electric vehicle over another, depending on whether or not it can accept the same amount of charge. So right now you pay generally, I think, by the minute for how long you're using these charging stations. There are other states in the country where you can charge by the kilowatt hour. And so you're paying for the electricity that's actually going in to your battery, but right now in Montana, it's you cannot charge by the kilowatt hour.
And that was a somewhat artful dodge there, Neil. But to the question of whether this program will have any cost measures in place? Is there any guidance in the FHWA from the FHWA with regard to that specific question about the program guidelines?
Well, I guess they could install a meter, couldn't they? So if you could do that in Montana, and you had it one of these fast charging locations in the middle of a parking lot like Walmart in Missoula, you could, I think, separately meter that little footprint of the parking lot so that you could track for each of the stations how much electricity is running through it, and how much kilowatt hours are being used. So I would think that would be an eligible cost for just the, as it applies to just those charging stations. I think that if you were to attach it to a parking garage, for example, and the meter was for the entire parking garage and how much electricity the lighting used and whatnot, that would not be an eligible cost. But as it pertains to just the charging station, I believe it would.
Question in the chat from Joseph. A couple questions tagged on here. What companies received awards under the Volkswagen settlement, and are there charging cost stipulations under the Volkswagen settlement?
Sorry, Ben, could you say that again, please?
You bet. A question in the chat from Joseph Hauk related to Volkswagen funding. What companies received awards under the Volkswagen settlements, and are there charging cost stipulations under the Volkswagen settlement?
So the way we did it under what we called Fast Charge Your Ride, that was announced in the end of September 2020, and we announced the funding for in November of last year. The awards went to Northwestern Energy, Town Pump, GBP Enterprises, which operates the new Sinclair gas station in Gardner, and then also to Missoula Electric Cooperative, which is installing a fast charger at the Seeley Lake Community Foundation location. And in that funding opportunity, even though it was for fast charging stations, which do consume quite a bit of electricity compared to slower level 2 chargers, which uses the same amount of electricity about as your drying machine, Joseph. We didn't say whether or not they needed to charge for charging at a fast charging location. But if they did, there needed to be at least 2 different methods of payment in order to do that. It couldn't just be an app that you would have to subscribe to in order to be able to pay for. So those were the requirements, and obviously making sure that those charging stations were connected to the internet, whether it was Wi-Fi or something else, to make sure that those payments could be processed, that there was adequate, security so that credit card information couldn't be taken by hacking into that charging station. Those were the requirements. So far as we can tell from the February 10th guidance from FHWA, it's pretty similar. We'll see if there's more detail. Hopefully there will be more detail come the May 13th guidance, but that's what we did with Volkswagen in Montana.
One quick addendum to that question. Neil is speaking to the fast charger ride funding opportunity, which is most relevant and similar to the NEVI program. There have been a number of other funding opportunities through our Volkswagen funding, including vehicle replacements and level 2 chargers. But I think Neil covered the most relevant piece. Just a note, we are coming up on the hour. We are going to stay on and keep the webinar open to address additional questions. There's a handful of additional questions we haven't reached yet. So if you haven't had your question answered yet, please hang on if you can. I'm going to go now to a raised hand, Representative Marianne Dunwell. I'm going to unmute you. You can go ahead and, let's see, and provide your question or comment.
Oh, thank you, Ben and Neil and Kyla. My name is Representative Marianne Dunwell. I represent Helena and East Helena. Big shout out to you for administering this important fast charging program. And another big shout out to the Congress that in a bipartisan measure passed the infrastructure bill, and especially to our own Montana Senator John Tester for sponsoring the infrastructure bill that funds this and many other programs. My second point, and please consider this comment, I'm very suspicious of putting these chargers on private property. I think moving forward, regardless of the Volkswagen plan, I think moving forward, these should be state-owned and state-operated, just like our highways are maintained by our MDT. It's part of our highway infrastructure now moving forward. And then thirdly, thank you for answering my question earlier about Highway 12. And I would just encourage, I understand there's only 6.3 million for this first round, this main corridor, but certainly please do consider well-traveled ancillary rural routes, because Montana is rural, and it's important. These are well-traveled routes, and I think we need to make this a Montana-made solution. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Representative Dunwell.
Going back to, thank you, Representative Dunwell, for the comments. Going back to a question in the chat from Ian Lund. How are the private owners hosts identified and selected?
Well, again, not knowing what the actual funding opportunity looks like yet, Ian, as we develop this plan that'll inform that funding opportunity. What I can say from Fast Charger Ride is that we opened it up to any entity that wanted to apply that included governmental, local government entities, as well as private nonprofit or for-profit businesses. And so for the 4 that were selected for awards, which I mentioned, Town Pump, Northwestern, Missoula Electric, and Gardner Sinclair Gas Station, those are people that saw the funding opportunity announcement, asked questions about it, and decided to apply and make it work for their business. So that's the way that we've done it so far. But we're also, again, using this public comment period to find out whether or not that's something that we should continue to do, tweak, change, go in a completely different direction, whatever you think Montana makes the most sense.
Going to a question in the Q&A from Susan Evans. With private entities owning and operating the facilities, will there be oversight to standardize charges and prevent price gouging?
That's a really good question. I think that we're hoping to get some more guidance. I'm not sure if the February or May 13th guidance will touch on that. Right now, again, because Montana current law allows for only time of charge, time of use charging, and not by the amount of electricity, they are different right now. There are 7 non-Tesla fast charging locations in Montana, and 3 of them are Electrify America that I already mentioned before, and then 4 of them are all different. And my guess is, not having visited any of them, that the rate to charge is probably different. So that's certainly a question that we should ask, just to make sure. But this part of DEQ, the Energy Office, is not a regulatory agency, so I'm not quite sure how we would do that. But this is a transportation program, so there's, again, a lot of caveats, like there are on how far the funding will get stretched. So that's definitely a question we should ask. Thank you.
Neil, a question from Jameson Lee. Will out-of-state entities like Electrify America and Evie Go be eligible for these funds, or will priority be placed on local applicants and businesses?
Again, that's something that we'd like to hear more about, Jameson, in our public survey and public comments that we receive. I don't know if we could exclude out-of-state entities from applying. Maybe we could prioritize in-state, I don't know. Although I guess technically Northwestern well, they do have their headquarters, one of their headquarters here, but under the Volkswagen settlement, we didn't make any indication of that in our fast charger rides. So I guess we'd like to hear more from Montana about whether or not we should consider something like that, or if we should allow entities like Electrify America or other charging station owners and manufacturers from outside of Montana to apply and then end up hosting and owning these for at least that 5-year period, if not longer. We'd like to hear more on that.
And Neil, I would add that this funding will be managed in accordance with Montana procurement law, which may provide guidance or restriction along those lines as well. A question from, one more comment from Representative Dunwell. In addition to her previous comment, also the state could charge a fee to charge and thus help with highway maintenance costs and make up for any reduction in gas tax revenue. A question from Whitney Olson. Could you, or maybe I missed it, tell us why state law only allows to charge by time, not by the kilowatt hour?
Yeah, I can tackle that one. So Montana Code annotated 69.8.802 references electric vehicle charging stations and says that the rate that a public charging station charges cannot be based on the cost of electricity. And if an entity were to charge by the kilowatt hour, they would be considered a public utility. And because of this provision that they cannot charge based on the cost of electricity, that makes it so that the companies currently are charging by the minute or the hour, or they have a subscription kind of based fee.
We'll drop that reference to MCA into the chat box.
Neil, Kyla, that wraps up the questions and comments that I'm seeing in the Q&A in the chat. I'd like to put out one more call for comments. If you wish to provide a comment, you can raise your hand, or if you're on the phone, press *9 and then *6 to unmute. Any further questions or comments for today? And as Neil mentioned, of course, the public survey is open, and we're ready to accept comments on that public survey as well.
Well, if there's nothing else, Ben, we'll just close by reminding people of our contact information. And myself, Neil Ullman, my colleague Kyla Mackey, who's been super helpful with responses to the questions this afternoon, and our counterpart Carol over at MDT. Please visit our website below to get the information on the public survey, as well as the February 10th guidance I've repeatedly referenced throughout. There's a direct link to that. Also, feel free to sign up for our email updates, where we'll be posting additional information as it comes out, including when we hear on the May 13th guidance from the Federal Highway Administration. And feel free to ask us any additional questions. We'll be taking the notes from today and including it as we consider and continue to build out our Evie deployment plan that will be submitted before August 1st. So if you do have a comment that you would like to have included or submitted, please make sure to submit it before June 30th. And we'll be taking the next few weeks after that in order to start developing the deployment plan. We hope to be able to share the deployment plan with Montana as we work to get it approved. So again, sign up for emails to get updates on that. Otherwise, thank you all for participating. We appreciate your input and questions, and have a great rest of the afternoon.